All right. Well, Craig Hewitt, let's roll right into the next episode here. I think it might be cool to just do like sort of a random show here because there's a bunch of other loose ends that I think are interesting to talk about. We can go a number of different ways. We touched on a little bit of like the funding versus being bootstrapped and hiring and things like that in the last episode. We can get into that. You and I have both been through different types of funding rounds. Another interesting thing, and this sort of tracks back to my episode a few weeks back with Laura Roeder. She moved from the U.S. to the U.K., I believe. You are American, and then you and your family moved to France. You and I actually hung out in France.
Switzerland.
That was in Switzerland, right?
Slightly better version of France.
Yeah. So that was cool, but you have since moved back. So I'm curious to know about the U.S., living in the U.S. versus living in Europe, and even as an entrepreneur, what that's all about. So I don't know, where do you want to dive in here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the living abroad and all that is interesting. Maybe the more unique thing that I could talk about. Like, there's a lot of folks that have taken funding, and we can talk more about that for sure. I think like living abroad. Oh man, there's so much to say. There's not like an answer, right? And I think that's like the short version. So yeah, from the U.S., moved to France when my son was 3 and my daughter was 5. Stayed there until about 10 months ago, and we moved back, and we're in just outside Providence now.
So how many years were you in France?
So 5 years.
Okay.
Five and a half years.
And where are you from? Florida originally?
I'm from Florida originally. Yeah.
Okay. Very cool.
And we moved, and kind of was the plan. Like, quit my job, was running a podcast motor, decided we wanted to travel because our kids were young and we didn't have any pets or a house or anything like that. We had sold our house and had planned on traveling a lot and then figuring out like where we wanted to live. Traveled for a couple of months and then landed in like the south of France, and it's like amazing, right? Like totally amazing. Ended up
That's a pretty impressive spot to me for you guys to settle down because, we traveled around Europe. That was when you and I hung out for a day there. And as much as I loved seeing France, it was really cool. It was definitely the most difficult country for us to make our way through, especially with the language barrier. My
Sure.
wife and I both have zero French. We speak a bit of Spanish, but no French. So
Yeah.
like going into a restaurant was really difficult.
Yeah.
I can't imagine sending my kids into school there.
Yeah, and I mean that's like a whole thing. I mean, like so like education, in a way, was a lot better in France. Was much more rigorous. Like a perfect example, my daughter's in 6th grade here now, and we go to like open house the other day, and they're like, okay, your student is going to have 10 spelling words per quarter, and they have to get those right. And I'm like, are you kidding me?
Words.
Like when she was in 4th grade, she would have 10 words every week. And they're like not easy words. And so I'm like, this is just like, so that's good that it's more rigorous. It's bad that like in a more traditional learning environment, they learn a bunch of stupid stuff. Like they had to memorize poems and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, what are you doing teaching my kid like all this stuff that they're never going to use? And I know that's like kind of the part of education, but like, I mean, from an education standpoint, like one, it's another language, whatever, like the kids understood everything fine. But it's just like super old school there. Whereas like here we moved to Barrington where we live because it's one of the best like school districts on the East Coast, at least. And it's amazing. Like the stuff they do and the technology they have and the kinds of programs they have in and out of school is totally amazing and way better than in France. And so like, that is by far the best thing about living here. Like,
so if I understand correctly, you mean like the technology and the maybe the format or the structure and the resources available in the U.S. have come a long way, and they're maybe a little bit more cutting edge, but the teaching style and the curriculum
yes,
in France is still from before, which is probably more rigorous than where the U.S. has gone. And I definitely see this too. Like, it just seems like what gets to me sometimes about public education, my kids are in first grade and third grade here in public school, but I wonder how this plays out in as they get a little bit older. Is like I've always found that like school is not really teaching like problem solving. It's like to me that's the most important piece of whatever it is. Like take a bunch of pieces and connect the dots and figure out how to and we've got this big hairy problem. We've got a lot of options. We've got to figure it out. Maybe that's just the entrepreneur in me, but like, I don't think that it, like looking back on my schooling in public school is just a lot about memorization, like read the textbook, memorize the textbook, write it down on the test, and then forget it all the next day. Like, I don't know how that's helped.
I mean, I think that like, I'm sure it's not great, but here it's a lot better than it was in France because there was zero of that. It was literally study for the test, take the test. And they have standardized tests in middle school and high school that like dictate your entire life. So like, it's just really, I don't know if draconian is the right word, but like really traditional, like authoritarian. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that like schools can't teach things like entrepreneurship too much, and there's probably a lot of opportunity there. Yeah. I mean, I think that like aside from education, language is a big thing. We lived there 5.5 years and my wife and I are, quite fluent in French. But it's like a continuum, right? Like a spectrum. Like you are fluent to be able to talk to your, the other kids in the village and their parents about like normal daily stuff. But like our house got broken into one time and I had to go to the police station. And like, those are not words you use when you're talking about the soccer team, And so like that what my wife and I say is it's like just the mental overhead of living in another culture, like your fucking visa and how long until that has to renew and what are you doing and how many days have you been in the United States for this tax break that you get? And do you have to file 2 sets of taxes now because you didn't, whatever. And like, it's just all this stuff that like, now I'm in the US and like, I don't have to do anything. I don't have to worry about any of that. Like everybody speaks English. I understand how everything works because this is like where I grew up and all that. So it's like super easy. But at the same time, like living in Europe is amazing, right? Because like you can travel, like I looked it up the other day, you could travel Geneva to Rome for $35. And it's like that doesn't exist anywhere around here. And it's just, Europe is so cool, but it's not exclusive to Europe.
On the travel thing, there's the argument to be made that like you're a visitor in Europe, so it's amazing for you to go see all these places that are easily accessible when you live there, right? But you're also easily accessible to New York City and Boston, which are also amazing cities. But to us, we take them for granted because we see them all the time, right?
Totally true. Yep.
But
totally true.
I'm also curious about the cultural difference, whether it's day-to-day life or maybe being a business owner or any of that. But like, correct me if I'm wrong here. One observation that I seem to have is it seems like these days, and this could just be us because we're me and my wife, my family, we're pretty quiet. We're not super social and outgoing locally here. We have our friends, we have family, and I have a lot of my connections with folks. But like on my block, in my neighborhood, neighbors are not hanging out and talking to each other. We go to the school functions. Most parents are not talking to each other. There's a few that are friendly, and we're friendly with some, but like it's not a big social thing. And we were hanging out in Paris. We had an Airbnb for like a week or two over there, and everyone on the block was like getting together for happy hour and young professionals with kids. I don't know. Like, is that something that you notice? Like America is at least, especially in the suburbs, I think probably more so in the suburbs, there's just more, everyone sort of locks their doors, stays in their lane. And there's not as much socializing, at least not even when I was a kid too. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's tough, man. Like I agree. Like, and I'm trying to make sure I don't like generalize too much because we've just not been here that long. You know, we moved in December and it's fucking winter in New England and like nobody does anything. And then like, yeah, in the summer we got out a lot more and now it's fall again. And yeah, but yeah, I mean, we've been here 10 months and we've been like over to people's house or had people over 4 or 5 times, I think, in 10 months. Whereas before it was all the time, every weekend, having people over or whatever. Conversely, though, like our kids are all over the place. I mean, we live in a place probably like you where like they just run down the street and go to someone's house and say they'll be back in 2 hours. And in that respect, it's about the same. Like, so for the kids, they are as social and open or whatever as they were before. And I think that like if you ask my kids, they'll probably say that like they're making deeper connections here because there's not that even very small, subtle like language or cultural barrier. Yeah. You know, like references to, you know, like Big Lebowski kind of references that like they have no idea because they didn't grow up in France. They're not French. They don't get all that stuff. You know, they like eating tacos and, you know, they eat their waffles with a fork instead of rolling them up. Like it's all these little things that you 100% will always be different living in another world, in another country, even if you live there a really long time and generally fit in. It's all this little things. And I think that's kind of what got us. It's like, it's all the little things that just after a while are just like, fuck, this is really hard.
Yep. So yeah, so like, what was the decision to move back? Like, what went into that?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a lot of little things, right? One is taxes. You know, I went from not paying myself anything basically when we moved, and because we had a whole ton of savings, to paying myself, you know, a good salary, and like that's a big tax bill in France, and yeah, didn't want to live there if I have a really big tax bill someday. That was one. That maybe was like the biggest, but maybe not the most urgent. My daughter went into like the equivalent of middle school there, and school got really hard. And so like doing schoolwork with a middle schooler is hard, but in another language is super hard. And so like legit like couldn't help her with her homework. And that was like really hard. Now she like middle school's 4 years there. So she was in the second half of 5th grade and we moved back here, fine, but now is in middle school here and is doing like geometry and shit, and I'm like, whoa, I gotta like, I'm an engineer too, and I'm like, I gotta like figure this stuff out again.
I wouldn't be able to do like 6th or 7th grade work here in America, you know.
Yeah, I mean, so like we knew that we couldn't really help them at all, and
but
like
it does seem like good timing for the kids' age to have a big move like that. Like you're not in smack in the middle of high school, right? Like
yeah. So basically said like somewhere around here, if we're gonna do it, we got to do it. We have older parents, and being close to them like is important as they need more of our help. And that was good because my dad was in the hospital for a week and a half in the winter, and was able to go down to Orlando and be with them and help my mom. Yeah, just a lot of little things. You can't like, we couldn't buy a house because like if you're not on like the super badass visa, you can't qualify for a mortgage. And like we'd rented a house for 5 years, and that's lame, like for your personal financial situation. So just a lot of those little things. And now we're back here, and a lot of those things are better, you know? And then at the same time, we're like, man, we lived in like Tahoe, basically, you know, like we lived in a really, really sweet place. And a lot of the physical location where we live now is not as good, but like the school, and it's ultra safe. It's pretty close to a lot of really cool stuff. So yeah.
I think it's cool that you moved back to the Northeast. I feel like most people, in our circles at least, they tend to like default to somewhere out west, like Portland or Colorado or whatever, like Chicago. Like one of the, like, I feel like the Northeast gets sort of like slept on. I mean, sometimes for good reason. Like, yeah, it can be overcrowded up here. It can be more expensive than it should be. But like, we've got some pretty decent beaches here. We've got New York City, Boston. We've got some mountains up here in the Northeast, you know.
Yeah.
There's stuff to like up here. And we've got the fall, which is just kicking in now, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like objectively, you know, Amanda, my wife, and I say like I don't think there's like a place that is so much better in the US than where we live. Like, yeah, sure, maybe we could have moved to Portland and it would be a little bit better, but there's a lot of really bad things about Portland that like just don't exist here. And so like, yeah, I don't think that's not a significant enough difference to make us think about like moving again. Like the only thing we think about is like, now that we've lived here, are the bad things that we saw in Europe really that bad, or were we just kind of like overly sensitive to them? And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's a chance we'll end up back there.
Really? You think you would move back again?
Yeah.
Interesting. Like after kids graduate, that sort of thing?
100% after kids graduate, we will.
Yeah.
And maybe before, because I mean, I don't have to tell you about like fucking guns and safety and stuff like that, but I mean, I will say 100%.
You've mentioned that to me a couple of times. I'm curious about that because this has absolutely crossed my mind 100 times. Probably most parents in America these days. And look, I don't want to get too political here, but like,
I'm happy to get very political.
All right, but like guns specifically, it's so terrible that it has to cross my mind every time my kids go to school. I mean, literally every morning. I'm not joking about this. Like I think about this every single morning. Like, what if today is the day that the news story that's going to happen somewhere? What if it happens here today? It's just fucking terrible. And I've said this a number of times when one of these big, shootings happen. Like, at what point is it irresponsible for me as a parent to not actively think about leaving because of this? Is like at a certain point, it's like, how irresponsible can you be to stay?
Yeah.
But millions and millions of us are here, so it's like, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I just like, having lived in a place where you never think about it because it just doesn't exist. It's significant, like the mental overhead. Because I'm the same way. I hug and kiss my son every day. He gets on the school bus, and I kiss my daughter on the way out the door because she walks to middle school. I only do that because, I think, fuck, like this is the day, and if I don't hug and kiss them this time, then I'm gonna regret the hell out of it. Whereas before, I would just be like, later, you guys have fun because I know they're coming home. Yep. And I mean, 100%. If there's another big thing like that, like our kids will not finish the day at school and we will not be here that night. Like, we're just gone because it's so easy. Like, anyone listening to this show could move to Greece, Portugal, Ireland, the UK instantly.
The other thing that gets to me is the healthcare system. And again, not to get too into the weeds, but this is the kind of thing that, like, just as a customer of a service, if it were any other service, I'd be like, no, this is totally ridiculous. I'm taking my business elsewhere. Why are we paying so much for such terrible care, for such bureaucracy and crazy systems between insurance companies and, specialists all over the place? And I mean, it's just unreal. I mean, okay, literally this week we got a bill. So my daughter had a freak allergic reaction to a fruit. She's never had the allergic reaction before. We had to put her on an ambulance, went to the ER a couple months ago. She was fine after a few hours, but it was a scare, right? But it was nothing. Like, it was a 5-minute ambulance ride to the ER, had a small dose of medicine, and she was fine. We just got the bill for $1,700, like 4 months later. And that's what it is. Like, and this is like a regular occurrence.
I mean, this would be really interesting. Someone way smarter than me, I'm sure, listening to this may be able to like actually do the math. But like, you do the math on what your taxes get you versus in a place like whatever, the Netherlands or France or Portugal or whatever. And you think about retirement, you think about college, you think about healthcare, you think about safety, you think about school, that a lot of people have to send their kids to private school. And like, yeah, again, I haven't done the math. I'm sure I'm not like smart enough to to do the math, but it's probably like a wash, you know? And I said
Yeah.
we moved back here because of taxes. Like, I don't know if that's right. Like, I don't know that, well, certainly there's not an amount of money that would make me feel good about my kids not being safe, you know? And I didn't appreciate that before we moved. And I definitely, like, that part of the decision I regret. And that would 100% be the reason we leave again.
I think as an American, like what's really hard about it for me now, I don't know if I don't think that it's just getting older. I think what happened was like 10, 15, 20 years ago, there were plenty of problems in America then too. But there was a sense of like, well, things are probably going to get better. Like maybe if we, you know, in the next election cycle or, you know, certain things are moving in the right direction and you know, we could see mechanically how things could get better. And now there's just a sense of like hopelessness. Like
I gotta say, like, no, this is as good as it's going to get, right? Because you have like a reasonable person running the country right now. And I think there is zero
and like
chance that
all logic is like, the next election cycle is probably not going to work out so well. And so it's like
a reasonable person will not be running the country in 2 years. And like, that is just asinine, right? Like for the most successful country in the world, right? By a lot of measures to be just so dysfunctional in the leadership role.
And even when the person that you might vote for is in the White House, like Congress is the most dysfunctional it's ever been in the history, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, basic laws that shouldn't even be arguable just cannot get passed, and then if they are passed, then they can't even implement them, and it's just like ridiculous, you know? So it's like, to a certain point, it's like, well, what are we doing here? You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think to be fair, everywhere has their version of this, right?
Sure.
And it is your ability to be aware of it here versus if you live in another country, like you don't get all the stuff, you know, even if it's an English speaking country. Yeah. And I think that it's just the issues that every country has, right? Like it might not be guns in most other countries, but it's healthcare or it's retirement or it's the cost of housing or whatever. I think everyone has their problems. And so like thinking about leaving just for that is probably not what I would do, but if the specific issues that we have are significant enough, then I think it's worth considering. And that's just me and my wife.
Well, I guess sort of, you know, getting it back to a somewhat positive note as we wrap this up here, like, I'm curious to know about entrepreneurship, you know, again, like culturally between living in America, owning a business in America, especially an online business compared to Europe. I do feel like I get the sense that startup culture is global now. It's not just an American thing. I mean, people think of America and capitalism, and it's sort of like in our blood here. Maybe there's some level of that. I mean, both my grandfathers were small business owners, and my father's a small business owner. And so like it sort of runs in the blood here, at least for me, and I know for a lot of Americans. But curious if you've seen anything like in terms of the culture of being a business owner, whether there's like a more like a more aggressive nature or more you know, finding and seeking opportunities as an American versus you know, people living somewhere else.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that, yeah, like I said to a lot of my friends that like I didn't want my kids to grow up with the kind of entitled like French attitude about a lot of things. I have a lot of French friends, and they're amazing, and maybe they'll listen to this, but like we are like, I don't know, but just I'll figure it out. Of course I can do this because I want to. And that is not universal. You know, there are a lot of really smart, successful people in a lot of countries that just like, they just don't think about that at all, you know, and that's a huge generalization, but that's me living in both worlds and having friends both places that like, it's very American to say like, sure, I'll just go figure it out, you know, build the parachute on the way down. It's much less common, I'll say, at least in like in France, at least. And I think that like, as you get into, more progressive countries, it becomes more common, right? Like again, you know, Scandinavian countries, you know, Ireland, UK, more common. Yeah.
I think that especially these days, one thing that all these like non-American countries and especially first world, so Canada, UK, France. Well, I don't know about France specifically, but like I see a lot of our friends in Canada and UK, like it is easier for them to get into entrepreneurship than it is for an American today. Because again,
Healthcare,
like the things we were talking about, mainly healthcare, healthcare being tied to your employer in America, and then still costing a ton of money, is a huge blocker to entrepreneurship, and that's what amazes me about American society today is that we are not like, and that's what really angers me about. Of course, this went right back to the dark side, but that's what really angers me about healthcare and the folks who are fighting for more healthcare coverage, because they're not making the argument for the entrepreneur. The right wing of this country sort of gets credit as like the business wing, when really, if you want to talk about business and entrepreneurship, make it easier, remove the barriers, let folks like me buy into a public option, do stuff like that to make it easier to go out on your own and leave full-time employment and start something, because everything else is easier. You can do it online. You can find customers anywhere. You can spin up a Stripe account. Those barriers from decades ago are not there anymore. It's just the government barriers that make it more difficult now, And so then we have a lot of friends in Canada and UK who, like, you see a lot of great entrepreneurs pop up there because they can take those risks earlier, younger, because that safety net is there. It's just in a lot of ways, it just seems like a backwards world we're living in these days.
100%, man. Yeah, I will say the most valuable thing we learned, I think, is like the work-life balance. Again, this is just like most of Europe, but like, a month of vacation in the summer is just what you do. And like, this summer living here, we had one of our friends actually went on vacation, maybe two, and everyone else is like, oh, we're just going to stay around here and the kids are in camp or whatever. I'm like, man, like our little village in France, literally no one is there the month of August. Literally the whole place is empty. Everyone goes to Italy or the south of France or the coast or whatever.
I don't think
it's awesome. It's because they're like, it's just like, one, like culture is there to support it, right? Just, it's cool that you're just not there for a month and work just doesn't exist and all this kind of stuff. And like, I never really embraced it because I was working a US schedule basically from France. And so like, I think that's just the one thing that like is really great, right, about most other places is like they legit have work-life balance. Whereas we're always chasing more, and like, that's cool. That's why we're so successful on the whole. It's also why there's just a lot of kind of stress related issues.
Mm-hmm. I know it all too well. I always feel like I'll never get away from the grind, and we take a lot of vacations, but I'm still working on the plane there and on the plane ride home, and working 50-hour weeks plus, and I don't know. That's what we do.
Going on vacation tomorrow, man. Excited.
Are you? Where are you going?
We're going to Phoenix to visit some family and head up the Grand Canyon for a bit.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Sweet. Yeah. That's one thing we got going for us over here. We've got some pretty beautiful national parks. It's been
totally.
Yep. It's been one of our family sort of goals is to hit them all. We did Grand Canyon a few years ago. We just this past summer we went to Yellowstone National Park, Grand Teton.
Nice.
Badlands. That was a really, really beautiful one. So
yeah, awesome.
Good stuff, man. Well, let's wrap it there. Craig, always a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, man. Thanks, Brian.
All right, later.